participation and labor share. She has also produced an amazing framework to understand feminist macroeconomics, is the so-called Purple, Green, and Red New Deal for Equitable, Sustainable Development. She's an active member of the IFE, and also she's very active at the Women's Budget Group. Without further ado, let me welcome to this interview to Onaran. So my first question is, can you tell us a little bit about your career and how did you get interested in macroeconomics? And to what extent do you think, if you have remained in your home country, what would be your possibilities to expand feminist macroeconomics?
Thank you very much, Iz. Thanks also to Yafi and Yazgı for having me. It's really very exciting to meet so many feminist economists from across the world today. Growing up in Turkey in the 70s, 80s, at the heat of neoliberalism, structural adjustment programs, I had really a first-hand experience in inequalities in terms of gender and class. My father had to take early redundancy from the bank he was working because it was being privatized. And my mother literally cooked everything from raw. We ate great and healthy, but she was never buying any ready ingredient for anything she was cooking other than raw food. She sewed coats from the old upholstery of our couches and chairs. I still possess one really nice long black coat and a black jacket from that. And I remember when my father had put on too much weight, she had also adjusted one of his trousers to fit to me. So I was always dressed very elegantly, but the amount of work that went into that by my mother was quite recognizable. And surely she wouldn't have done these if it weren't for the impact of neoliberalism and structural adjustment on women in Turkey. Well, out of this experience, then I got involved in women's liberation movement, in the Marxist movement. That brought me to a radical political economy, and there have been some remarkable women, Fevziye Sayılan, from whom I learned a lot, people of my generation like Evren Balta, when we were doing our first days of activism and campaigning against things like compulsory virginity control if your parents take you to a doctor to control your sexuality. Radicalizing through all of these, then I was introduced to political economy by economists like Nurhan Yentürk and Erin Geldan. So I decided to eventually become an economist. And for me, it was very important not just to understand, but also change the world with my research. I thought being an economist is really a very powerful thing to intervene into things that lead to gender and class inequalities. Motivated with that, eventually I did my PhD at Istanbul Technical University, which is, as mentioned before, on the effects of structural adjustment on labor market and distribution. Then moving forward for postdoc, I got involved in Economic Research Forum for Arab countries, Iran and Turkey, and worked on a project that was led by İnsan Tunalı, also from Turkey, and Ragi Assad from Egypt, based in the US. And the question there was the impact of structural adjustment policies on employment of women and gender gaps. We quoted two papers with another postdoc colleague of mine, Cem Başlevent, out of that project. And then I sent these papers to Nilüfer Çağatay and Günsel Berek. Sadly, we have lost Nilüfer. I'm sure she would be here today, but she's mentally certainly with me. And I have seen that Günsel has joined. It makes me very happy. Well, they have invited me then to Utah to the Gender and Macroeconomics International Working Group summer school they were organizing. I couldn't make it. I was crossing just too many borders that year. But the reading list of that summer school, about which I was very envious because I couldn't make it, then constituted the reading list for one of my first modules courses in gender and development. Fast forward, İpek İlkaracan, well, current president of YAFI, I know she's also here today with us, really has been a turning point in making me do more about gendering the macroeconomic models that I've been working on from my PhD onwards. I ended up in the European School of the International Working Group for Gendering Macroeconomics in 2013 in Krakow. Nilüfer was there, İpek was there, Diane Nelson, Rania Antonopoulos, and Özge İzdeş were there, among others. And really, I remember past midnight, İpek was pushing me to integrate gender in the structuralist, post-Keynesian, Kaleckian models, which I had been working through. Well, that culminated in, long story short, in several projects. I got funding for a PhD from the University of Greenwich, with which we have recruited Eurydice Fotopoulou as a PhD student. We created more funding from the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, Economic and Social Research Council of Britain. Later, I ended up working in the large project Sergi was leading, Sergi Flora at American University was leading, funded by Hewlett Foundation and Open Society. There we worked together in addition to Sergi, İpek, also with Eliza Brownstein, who was leading the gendering macro pathway in the large project. Stephanie Seguino was part of it, and I met Karen Groen in person for the first time. And of course, the work that we have been doing with the Women's Budget Group in Britain, with Diane Nelson and Sue Himmel-White, have been very important sources of both inspiration, but also push for me to go further in integrating gender to macroeconomic analysis and macroeconomic policy discussions. Back to your question is about, could I have done feminist economics in Turkey if I had remained there? Well, yes, I could have done. One of my maybe losses by leaving Istanbul was that İpek İlkaracan had joined Istanbul Technical University coming from New School in the last year that I spent in Turkey. So we overlapped and worked together. To that year, I owe a lot, but obviously, this is not to gloss over the usual problems in working conditions in terms of both pay, but also freedom of speech for progressive economists in Turkey universities these days. But I've spoken too much, but I also want to learn from you is, you tell me, how did you get interested in feminist macroeconomics to the extent that you're hosting this event today?
Well, I've always been interested in feminist economics, and at some point in my in the last years of my career, I was more interested on the macroeconomic aspects. This allowed me to consider taking the course of gender-aware macroeconomics, the joint program of the Libby Economics Institute and the American University. So these pushed me towards specific topics of research that really combine feminist economics, macroeconomics, or at the end, feminist macroeconomics. So it was really also the experience of meeting some scholars that they are overlapping from your own path within feminist macroeconomics, such as İpek İlkaracan has been a mentor and an amazing co-author to me, and also it's been really inspiring me, my current research, but also Diane Nelson and Siforbe, that I think she's also here. So by integrating this feminist perspective in macroeconomics, I've found really inspired by the works of these amazing women, including you, for of course. And that's why I got interested in this. Without further ado, let's get into the bread and butter of this Feminist 101 series. So as we are in a Feminist Economics 101 series, and this is, has to be somehow introductory, our first goal here is to provide a more comprehensive definition and exploration of the main contributions of feminist macroeconomics. So how would you define feminist macroeconomics for the audience, for the those in the audience who might don't know? And who does it make a research project in economics to be, in macroeconomics to be feminist?
Just to summarize the many contributions feminist economics might make to macroeconomics, I'll emphasize three essential components of feminist macroeconomics. The first is to place the care economy as a key sector in your analysis. Macroeconomics is aggregate in nature, but more advanced or more realistic macroeconomic analysis and models actually do have multiple sectoral analysis in it. That won't be too many. You would think of 2 sectors, 3 sector models. For me, one of those sectors has to be the care economy. Learning from the very idea, feminist economic idea, that labor needs to be reproduced. It doesn't grow on trees. And that reproduction includes both paid and unpaid work, unpaid domestic work, which is predominantly being done by women, which is essentially ignored in conventional macroeconomics. The second essential component of feminist economics that would contribute essentially greatly to macroeconomic analysis is to integrate the importance, the role of gendered social norms, how that shapes a gendered patriarchal division of labor in our society and thereby economy, and what that means for macroeconomic behavioral differences among men and women. Just to give some examples, for example, those gendered social norms mean differences in the behavior of men versus women in the way they consume out of their income. For example, the so-called marginal propensity to consume for women and men may be different, and not just different in general, but it may also differ in terms of how much of their income they consume in goods and services that are related to the care economy versus the rest of the economy. And that will then have important macroeconomic effects on things like productivity or things like labor supply. So gender differences in labor supply behavior is another thing, of course, that is crucially affected by gendered social norms. Probably this is now the most accepted part of the contribution of feminist economics in macroeconomics in general. And of course, most importantly for me, learning a lot from the Women's Budget Group economists in Britain, what the government does in terms of its fiscal policy, in particular, how and where it spends, as well as whom it taxes, has very crucial effects. So there are different macroeconomic effects of government spending in the care economy versus physical infrastructure. Of course, there are gendered effects of these, but also macro impact on things like the productivity of the rest of the economy is affected by how and where the government invests or spends. And finally, if we want to understand income distribution, it is not neutral. It is shaped by these gendered social norms, which in turn shapes gendered as well as racial profiling of jobs. That has crucial implications for the bargaining power and income distribution of women versus men and different ethnic or racial groups. And all these aren't just about distribution or fairness. They do in turn affect macroeconomic outcomes as well.
Okay, so now that we have I work in definition of feminist macroeconomics, I guess that it's in everybody's mind, the dichotomy between microeconomics and macroeconomics. So why do you think gender has been considered neutral by many macroeconomists in comparison to microeconomics, where gender has been more systematically researched?
This is surprising, isn't it? It's surprising to me in terms of where I come from in terms of literature, post-Keynesian, Kaleckian macroeconomic literature, because class as a category has been integrated to post-Kaleckian, post-Keynesian macroeconomics, in particular the strand that tries to synthesize Keynes and Marx, going back to the early work really by Michał Kalecki, a Polish economist, and here we are going back to 1940s. So why has gender not been integrated until very recently? Has been a question, actually. Nilüfer Çağatay, Diane Nelson, and Karen Brown has asked, as feminist heterodox macroeconomists, to other heterodox but not feminist macroeconomists in early 1990s. And we read quite an insider story of that in the tribute to Nilüfer, which Diane and Karen have written in Feminist Economics after sadly we lost Nilüfer, how one of the men heterodox economists in answering the question about integrating gender to macro said macro is about aggregate variables, so it's not about men versus women. I was quite shocked when I heard that insider story, and I was thinking, why class but not gender? If macro is about aggregate, then it would be only one national propensity to consume out of total income. But the whole issue of Kaleckian structuralist post-Keynesian models is to talk about workers versus capitalists. Then why don't we talk about men and women workers or capitalists? Well, because those heterodox macroeconomists were also gender blind, sadly. They did ignore how gender inequalities shape and are shaped by social norms, and how they affect economic behavior of men and women differently in ways I have mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Well, as a consequence, they are sadly also unaware that these gendered behavioral differences have macroeconomic effects on labor supply, on productivity, on consumption, on private investment. And as you said, is in contrast to that, in microeconomics, actually both in the radical political economy of gender, class, and race inequalities, as well as to be fair, in mainstream microeconomics, gender gaps in wages have attracted more attention. In mainstream microeconomics, this is partly because it has been impossible to ignore the massive gross gaps between men and women in terms of wage and employment gaps. And they have observed that even the returns to education, years of schooling, which is at the heart of the neoclassical micro human capital theory of wage differentials, is gendered. There are differences, massive differences in returns to the same kind of education by men and women. In radical political economy, stratification literature, the segregation and segmentation of labor markets with respect to gender, race, and class have been important in analyzing how the capitalist economy works. And of course, going back to the mainstream macro, since it is essentially founded on neoclassical microeconomic foundations, mainstream macroeconomics has addressed what Becker called household economics early on. Of course, these models ignore the social material basis of gender differences. Behavioral differences between men and women are boiled down to so-called choices. They are essentially biodeterminist in a way. And of course, the effect of patriarchal division of labor in the society and endogeneity of choices themselves are totally ignored. Households are often modeled as a harmonious unit in mainstream macro. Differences in power depending on specialization in paid market work by men versus unpaid domestic care work by women are ignored. Of course, there are newer incarnations of these mainstream macro models where conflict within the household or differences between men and women in utility maximizing function are acknowledged, but actually the reference point is never gender as a socially constructed category. It is always to female versus male differences in their utility maximization function. And to my surprise, decades after Becker, if you look at Handbook of Macroeconomics, very mainstream, the chapter on household economics there is no single reference to the journal of feminist economics. So the word feminism, gender, feminist economics don't feature there. But true, they have done macroeconomic modeling with male versus female behavioral differences in it earlier on than heterodox macroeconomists.
Okay, so after this explanation of how mainstream macroeconomics is flawed because they are different, they are gender blind and so on and so forth, I wanted to know your opinion on the role of IMF, World Bank, or United Nations in advancing gender-aware macroeconomics, as they are the main providers of data, main advisors of policy making, and so on and so forth.
Very interesting you ask it like that. They produce a massive amount of policy impactful research, but they're very different institutions. The IMF and the World Bank did rely essentially on neoclassical macroeconomics and focused on women's labor force participation as a bottleneck in labor supply, hence a supply side macro constraint. They have emphasized essentially the positive impact of closing gender gaps on education and health and thereby productivity in the economy. But these are essentially supply side mainstream macroeconomics. Most importantly, they ignore that neoliberal policies advocated by these institutions themselves lead to a fall in economic activity and thereby demand for labor. So increasing women's labor force participation alone may lead to more women entering the job market, but it also simultaneously leads to higher unemployment rate for some of these women. It also ignores the most important supply constraint on women's labor force participation, as many feminist economists like Stephanie Seguino and Diane Elson have later highlighted. The need for caring for the children, elderly, and the household as a whole is still there. So if you do not have an adequate social care infrastructure in the society, if the government, for example, is not providing affordable paid social care services, women will not be able to fully take up whatever job opportunities may arise. Of course, World Bank is also different from the IMF. I think World Bank employing Karen Brown, a feminist heterodox macroeconomist in mid-2000s, is a welcoming nuance within this very mainstream line. Different from the ODs, the United Nations, particularly UN Women, and later the ILO, has been a lot more influential in integrating work of feminist heterodox macroeconomists, development economists, trade economists such as Diane Nelson, Nilüfer Çağatay, Rania Antonopoulou, later İpek İlkkaracan and Valeria Esquivel and their work around the ILO's work on the care economy actually provide a totally different intellectual impact and a very valuable intervention in the policy debate in that international institutions environment.
Okay. At some point you mentioned supply side factors. Since this is a Feminist Economics 101 event, I would like to ask you, I mean, we often heard this type of concepts, right? Supply side, demand side. How would you define them? And why it's important for the advancement of feminist macroeconomics to define these factors differently? And what is the value added of feminist macroeconomics project in advancing macro modeling?
Yeah, just back to the basics now, since you have asked, demand side is about what workers or capitalists or governments do with their spending decisions in the economy, the consumption decision, investment decision of firms, exports or imports, and government spending and taxation, and who is being taxed and in which areas government is making its spending. So that's all about the demand side. The supply side is about labor supply or capital accumulation. Obviously, there is a dispute there between the mainstream versus heterodoxy, whether capital accumulation is really driven by the demand of the firms for investing, or is it a supply side thing? And related to that, what determines the technological change in terms of the productivity of labor or capital? Is that exogenous or endogenous with respect to the demand side is one of the dividing lines between heterodoxy versus mainstream. Mainstream macro, including those mainstream macro models integrating women and men that I mentioned before, actually think technological change is something that is exogenous to the demand side. Even in the new mainstream so-called endogenous growth models, technological change isn't something that is affected by demand. Heterodox, structuralist, post-Keynesian, feminist macroeconomics is the opposite, where technological change and the supply side itself is very much affected by the demand side. So the dividing line hence is that mainstream macro is essentially supply side economics. And even if you look at the new mainstream, new Keynesian economics, it's essentially replicating a very old dilemma of the 1950s neoclassical Keynesian synthesis economists such as Samuelson, where they say short run might have some involuntary unemployment, but long run essentially is determined by full employment. And hence, demand side might matter in the short run, but the long run is all about the supply side. Hence, crucial for us, government's actions can't alter the long run stationary state, steady state, or equilibrium of an economy. Heterodox, structuralist, feminist, post-Keynesian macro stands totally at a different side, where we do acknowledge the importance of both demand and the supply side, particularly in our more recent work, but they do interact. And not just demand, but also structural futures in terms of the gendered structure, gendered occupational segregation, for example, or gender norms, or what the government does in terms of its investment fiscal policies have crucial effects on both the demand side, but also on the supply side. It does affect productivity in the rest of the economy outside the care economy. It does affect labor supply of women versus men differently, which then brings us though to a positive conclusion. What the governments do will have effects, not just in the short run, but also in the long run of the economy. And it has some optimistic policy implications that we can and should implement government investment policies cleverly to change inequalities in terms of gender, race, and class, to end unemployment that has an involuntary nature, and also to influence the structure of the economy, to think about the development trajectory of a country.
So, in a sense, based on what you said, heterodox economics and feminist macroeconomics are kind of linked or intertwined. So how would you define feminist post-Kalekian macro theoretical model to somebody who never had a background in heterodox economics? And can you elaborate more on post-Keynesian underpinnings of feminist economics and feminist macroeconomics, since it's not that all of us have been exposed to heterodox thinking, since the hegemony is to being exposed to mainstream curricula in economics?
This is a very fair and very good question, difficult too. So post-Keynesian economics is essentially demand-led economics. Having said that, that doesn't mean that supply side doesn't exist, but they do interact, and demand leads the trajectory of an economy. Demand-led development models, if you like. It might sound sometimes easier to say this is essentially structuralist macro in terms of the intuitive explanatory power of the word structuralist, as opposed to post-Keynesian. If you don't know Keynes and what does post there refers to, the idea is that these are models where structural features of the economy and institutions matter. Structural feature as in the sectoral composition of the country, how import dependent the country is, or how poor or developed the public infrastructure is. Now, these are all important, and I said they are demand-led development models because what happens on the demand side in terms of changes to government spending or investment or consumption of households will have further effects on the macroeconomy. They won't be one-off effects. They will multiply themselves. If there is more demand in the economy, there will be more investment, more employment, more consumption, and altogether, they will lead to more economic activity and employment. Similarly, those structural features of the economy have impact on the distribution of income or wealth and employment. Now, this is important because that means demand side constraints in an economy matters. If there is not enough demand, firms will not invest. They will sit on excess capacity of machinery and equipment. They won't hire, and there will be unemployment of an involuntary nature. And I'm using the term involuntary unemployment here as a general term. That is actually, in general terms, non-employment. And this is not a voluntary labor supply choice of workers who are freely choosing to have more leisure, maximizing their utility, and deciding to sit at home. They would rather work, and they would rather accept even a lower wage, but there is not enough demand to hire their labor. And I'll come how important that could be from a feminist perspective later. But of course, in mainstream economics, the unpaid domestic care work done is also coming out of that decision of women to maximize their utility, not as a condition that is imposed on them by the care needs of the household and of the society. Now, within that post-Keynesian current, there are Kaleckian models. That's a strand within post-Keynesian economics that builds on the work of Mihail Kalecki, who himself was influenced by both Keynes, but also Marx and Rosa Luxemburg in his time, a Polish economist originally. And these Kaleckian models integrate class distribution and political economy into the post-Keynesian analysis. If you like, they are really a synthesis of Keynesian and Marxist economics in terms of also incorporating further structural features of the economy and institutions, such as bargaining power of workers versus capitalists, or the oligopoly power of certain firms in particular industries. And in these models, wages or the class distribution of income plays a dual effect. So wages of workers are not just a cost, as it is seen in mainstream new classical economics, but it is also a source of demand, and a very actually substantial source of demand. Now, where does feminist economics come into the picture here? Feminist economics brings in gender and the care economy as a key sector into these structuralist Kaleckian or post-Keynesian models. So the structural features of the economy isn't just about sectors or bargaining power of classes. It is also about the gender division of labor, both in terms of paid work and unpaid work. And it is a lot about disaggregating what the government public spending is doing in terms of where it goes. Does it go to the care economy? Does it go to physical infrastructure? If so, what type of physical infrastructure? So this is something that is brought in really by feminist economists like Diane or Ipek and others I mentioned into the macro analysis. This synthesis is essential actually for enriching both the feminist economic analysis, but also the post-Keynesian macro analysis, because as I said before, demand side, gendered structure of the economy or what the government is doing affects the supply side, productivity, labor supply, and also the distributional changes aren't just about functional class distribution of income, but it's also about gender gaps in wages and employment within the working class. These do have affect both functional class income distribution, but also the distribution of wealth between different classes. And these in turn, as Kaleckians have taught us, have effects on demand, because different classes, but also different genders have differences in their propensity to consume in different types of sectors. And these then essentially have productivity effects.
So, Ozlem, you have been working on providing different models within these post-Keynesian Kaleckian feminist macroeconomic models. And you have been very prolific. And indeed, I encourage again the audience to go through your last paper, Policy at Egypt Interventions, that summarize perfectly why feminist macroeconomics is needed to improve post-Keynesian macroeconomics and the other way around. So what these models that you have provided serve for understanding monetary policies and fiscal policies and its intersection with other gender identities such as other social identities such as gender, race, migrant status, and so on.
Well, part of that was really going back to 2013 Krakow GEM summer school, talking with Ipek, Nilüfer, Rania, and Diane, and really understanding that we need to broaden our theoretical framework in macroeconomics, in heterodox macroeconomics, bringing in this feminist insights. And the other part has always been for me, then bring that theory into empirical terrain. And this is where my idea of economists are very powerful, and they talk numbers all the time. They throw numbers at us, the mainstream economists. Well, we can throw our numbers back at them and try to answer really the socially relevant policy questions, such as What happens when the government invests, spends in the care economy? Because in our national accounts, this is seen as current spending. But feminist economists like Diane and Sue, Women's Budget Group, have been trying to bring home the message that, well, this is actually investment. It is investment in our social infrastructure. It is care economy infrastructure. So the model's motivation was both theoretically model the effect of an increase in public care infrastructure, but then also really trying to estimate that impact. And the other motivation for me was to ask questions like, what happens when we increase wages and close gender gaps? So in a fashion of upward convergence between men and women, which corresponds to basically giving a higher pay rise to people at the lower half of the wage distribution, and give still a pay rise to those at the top, but at a maybe lower pace, such that wages of both men and women are increasing, but gender gaps are closing. So what does it do to the economy? Is it just something that is good for gender equality, or does it have some further effects? Or we try to ask questions like, what is the effect of different taxation? If you increase the tax rate on wealth, maybe to fund investing in the care infrastructure, what happens? If you increase the progressivity of income taxation, increasing the tax rate on capital while decreasing the tax rate on labor, what happens? So just maybe very brief insight about the impact of public investment in the care infrastructure, such as hire more care workers and pay them decent wages while closing the gender gaps. It has massive impact on both the demand and supply side. On the demand side, consumption increases thanks to the newly hired or better paid care workers. This is a very labor-intensive sector, but also a sector with a very high share of women in employment. And it's not just consumption increasing, but the type of consumption is changing, because more income in the hands of women lead to households spending more on education, health, or care. So gender equality also leads to some private investment, if you like, in social infrastructure. In response to both this, but also simply more demand, private investment flourishes, and whatever impact, if any, comes from borrowing for this kind of public spending, if it has to be, has very small impact on public debt to GDP ratio. Sometimes actually public debt to GDP ratio doesn't even increase. That depends on the economy, and the impact of such an increase, if that happens on public debt as a ratio to the national economy size, on private investment is negligible. So yeah, governments could confidently invest in the care economy, and they should do so, particularly if they're concerned about productivity in the rest of the economy outside the care sector, because labor productivity does flourish if you invest in the care infrastructure. Of course, all these are feeding into more positive stimulus to investment and exports, because if productivity of the workers in a tradable sector in manufacturing goes up, even with increasing wages, productivity of workers increasing will cut down unit labor costs. And multiplier effects of such investment is huge. Despite massive productivity gains, the demand effect is so high that employment of both women and men increase. And I have seen that over and over in structurally different economies coming out of our econometric work. The other concept we coined is about the effect of wages and closing gender gaps, where we have shown that there are certain conditions under which our economies are actually equality-led, meaning more gender equality as well as better class equality is leading to more economic activity. Mind you, here the impact on demand is though small in terms of the economic size magnitude. in the medium run, productivity effects of better gender outcomes, as well as higher wages overall, is quite substantial. And if you rely on just the private market economy as the government, hoping that more equality will sort it, more economic activity, more employment, that won't happen, because productivity gains of better wages and better gender equality is quite substantial. What I ended up learning is if a government wants more employment or better employment outcomes, it needs to put its money where its mouth is, invest in the public infrastructure such that there is also more demand stimulus along with productivity gains. Sorry, I have spoken very long.
No. I just wanted to jump into the green, purple, red New Deal. If you can summarize a little bit, what does it mean? Because our time is, we are running out of time, and I think there is at least one question from the Q&A. So I have a couple of questions to go first. So if you can go ahead a little bit on over the green, purple, red New Deal.
Well, thanks for asking about it. It's very dear to my heart. The motivation is basically coming from the fact that we are facing multiple challenges, ranging from care needs in an aging society to climate change, intersecting inequalities in gender, race, and class, and a new form of technological change with robotization. So to address all of these challenges, we need a totally new paradigm, what we labeled as a needs-based approach to economic policy making, addressing both the deficits in the care infrastructure in our society, as well as the ecological deficits, while tackling the multiple inequalities. And such a joint intervention essentially at the core has public investment as the driving force in both social care economy infrastructure and public investment in the green economy. And there is no competition between these needs. Also, we are not in a place where we can afford to have a competition. So we need to use all tools, all means of funding, coordinate all policies in our toolkit, from fiscal policy, starting with fiscal policy, but also monetary policy, industrial policy, labor and social policies. Obviously, the public investment drive, particularly if you will start with a big bang, push in both the care and the green infrastructure, begs the question, how will we fund? Hence the importance of the multiplier analysis. Well, there is money, partly care investment will self-fund itself, or green investment will self-fund itself thanks to the high multipliers. But it's okay to borrow as well, because the spending investment should start with a big bang, meeting the urgencies and time requirements. So we need to define maybe what is adequate investment to borrow for. And it requires redefining the concept of infrastructure, as Women's Budget Group multiple times called, and label also social care infrastructure spending as investment, for which it's adequate to borrow. But we will need to also increase some tax rights that requires really taxing wealth and income in a more progressive fashion. Then, of course, there are policies such as national investment banks, development banks. They have to have gendered goals as well. And last but not least, we need to rethink monetary policy as something that will not be independent, but fully accommodate a fiscal investment mobilization that to me requires rethinking things like inflation target. So it's a feminist thing, for example, to say we need actually a higher 4 or 5% inflation target, consistent with all our social goals, such that we can accommodate a massive public investment program. Of course, that requires having red policies, old-fashioned, as increasing wage rates, with purple policies such as closing gender gaps, And obviously, there are a lot of complementarities here between purple and green, as well as Ipek had once said when she coined first the color purple economy or purple employment or purple investment. Purple or care economy jobs are essentially low carbon emission, labor intensive jobs. So it creates a lot of space for redeployment from brown fossil fuel based sectors. Obviously, there is a lot of thinking that we need in terms of changing gender norms. But again, it's not rocket science. If you make purple jobs, decent jobs with decent wages and working conditions, people will start queuing to get training to be hired in the purple economy. Yeah, so there is the mix of the green, purple, and red in the policy implication of our work.
Fascinating. Since we are close to our time, I just wanna ask the last question from my side before opening the Q&A. It's customary for the Feminist Economics 101 to ask the senior scholars to give some advice for we young or early career as me scholars. Some advice on how to navigate the field of economics, or specifically the field of feminist macroeconomics.
Yeah, that is important for survival, and good to share experience. But in my experience, broadening the research scope in terms of both the questions you ask, the regions you work on, and the theoretical framework. So synthesize theories, synthesize different strands in the literatures, cross disciplines, and synthesize literatures coming from different disciplines, bring together different methodologies. That in my case includes working with different types of data, macro, micro, but it should include also working with both quantitative and qualitative analysis. Of course, along with these, or together with these, comes also broadening your networks. That probably also means if you're a feminist economist, try to communicate with also economists who are not feminist, who are not heterodox, who are mainstream. Some of the mainstream economists are very empirically minded. So, for example, an important survival strategy is also diversify your publishing strategy. So look for mainstream empirical oriented journals. They could be quite more open than the very mainstream and theoretical journals. I keep saying journal because my generation woke up to the journal rankings. They have stayed, and I'm afraid they're here to stay until we can change them. So don't ignore them, but learn the rules of the game and expand your area of maneuver. So in that sense, diversify your publishing strategy, aim high, also aim at publishing in diverse disciplines journals. Feminist Economics is a great journal, but if you're working on ecofeminism, synthesizing feminist and ecological literatures, going for ecological economics as a journal will open you new avenues. Or if you're working on gender gaps in wages or employment, I find industrial relations journals to be very open-minded. Obviously, development or economic geography journals are always a lot more open-minded than mainstream ones. So journals such as Socioeconomic Review, again, bringing together international political economy, might be very helpful. Having talked a lot about maybe publishing, I should say, last word, external funding is becoming even more important. Again, try to find your own voice and strategy, diversify, but work with others as co-I first, eventually think of leadership too. And maybe I should end with that. Don't shy away from leading things. So of course, start with working with teams, but move towards first building and then leading teams, nurturing institutions and communities of both feminist economists and other economists with whom, or other social scientists, as well as external partners from the civil society organizations, trade unions, to broaden your institutional and community building effort.
Very value advices. I hope all the young scholars and early career scholars in the audience are wrapping up these advices. We are out of time. I will just catch one question from the Q&A, because I think I feel the rest have been already commented. So from Kaz Wilkinson, to what extent can this synthesis exchange between feminist economics and post-Keynesian macro speak to LGBTQ plus women or non-binary and trans people and other gender minorities within the economy?
Yeah, we have actually tried to address that. And I have myself very consciously moved away from using terms like female or male and try to use men and women. That is, for me, a gender that is both about social constructions, but also a gender of choice. So women refer to both cis women and trans women in that sense. Where we had more space, thanks to Eliza Brownstein in the Feminist Economics theoretical paper, we have put that note. It was also in the original working paper version. The more we got tighter in terms of spice, that footnote was lost, and we refer to, we keep referring to men and women, but I don't refer to any more male versus female, if that helps.
So I think we have covered mostly all the questions that I brought for you. And I think it was very, very inspiring. And I think it was it was an honor to have you and let explore all my doubts that I came across with reading your papers. And I think this is all. See you in the next Feminist Economics 101. Again, thank you all for being here and hearing to us, and of course to Ozlem and all the coordinators. Bye.
Thank you very much. And if Yazga can send me the chat, I would love to look at it, because I couldn't follow it. But thanks. It was an honor to be part of that discussion. Thanks, Iz and Yazga, and to all the friends who joined today. Bye.